Ida Early Comes Over the Mountain by Robert Birch. Published by Avon Books. Sixth grade reading level. Ida Early Comes Over the Mountain by Robert Birch. Taller than anybody. Ida Early came over the mountains, or else she came around them. Randall Sutton never was sure which. He just knew that early one Saturday morning in mid-July, someone had rapped on the door, and when he opened it, there she stood. "Howdy do," she said, flinging out her arms as if she expected him to rush into them. She looked for all the world like a telephone pole and seemed almost as tall. At the same time she reminded him of someone, but he couldn't remember who. Her face was plain, her complexion ruddy, and her hair light brown and stringy. She was not a real young person. Randall could tell that she was well out of her teens. Nor was she old, certainly not as old as his father, who was 34. She wore a patchwork shirt, a baggy brown sweater, and overalls. The elbows of the sweater and the knees of the overalls had been reinforced with scraps of canvas. Her shoes were brogans, clodhoppers they were called, and a small buckeye dangled from one of the laces. A buckeye was said to bring good luck. Randall didn't say anything, and his father, who had followed him to the door, only nodded. Ida Early stood there, grinning. At the outset of the Depression, people had stopped occasionally to ask for a handout, food or old clothes, but times were a little better now, and there were seldom beggars at the door. And none of them ever stood grinning as if awaiting a special welcome. Finally, Mr. Sutton asked, "Is there anything we can do for you?" "Let me think," she said, brushing away a corn shuck from above her left ear. Then Randall knew who she reminded him of. She favored the scarecrow that he and his friend J.C. had built last summer to keep birds out of the cantaloupe patch. That was it. She looked more like a scarecrow than a telephone pole. After Ida had scratched her head, she smiled at Mr. Sutton. "If you insist on doing something for me," she said, "you could maybe offer me a job." Mr. Sutton smiled back at her. "Are you a lumberjack or a field hand?" "Well," said Ida Early, "which would you be needin'?" "Neither, but it could be what we're wanting is some help with the cooking and other chores around here." "Well, then," said Ida, "this is your lucky day." She waved Mr. Sutton and Randall aside so that she could enter. "I'm one of the best cooks in the Blue Ridges." The Suttons lived at the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, on the Georgia side, but Randall had never heard anybody speak of them as anything except the mountains. Ida Early said, "Yes, sirree, I'm one of the best cooks I know about. As a matter of fact, I'm noted in Georgia, Tennessee, and both Carolinas for my cooking." Mr. Sutton said, "I'll have to see." Ida looked around the hallway. "What have you got that you want cooked up?" she asked, rubbing her hands together. "Just let me at it." "I mean, I'll have to see what Ernestine thinks." "Is she your wife?" "No, my sister. My wife died in the spring." "I'm sorry," said Ida. "I'm genuinely sorry. Is your sister looking after the family?" Randall thought that "bossing the family" would be a better way of putting what Aunt Ernestine did. "Yes," said his father, "but she's anxious to get back to her home in Atlanta. Let's talk to her." He led the way into the big room that was called the kitchen, but was the dining room and sitting room as well. There was a cook stove, cupboard, and icebox on one side, a table and chairs in the middle, and benches and more chairs over by the hearth. When Mr. Sutton led Ida Early into the kitchen, Randall's sister and his twin brothers were still at the table finishing their breakfast. "Howdy, one and all," said Ida, bowing to the three children. "Good morning," said Ellen. The twins, Clay and Dewey, didn't say anything. They just stared. Ellen, being 12, tried not to look too directly at Ida, but the twins, who were only 5, seemed unable to look anywhere else. Randall's father went in search of Aunt Ernestine, leaving Ida standing in the middle of the room. The twins, wiry and blond, like all the Suttons, and a bit small for their age, were identical except for a tiny scar on Dewey's forehead, the result of a fight they'd had on their second birthday. Clay had hit him with the dasher from the ice cream freezer. Clay slid down from his chair at the table and, followed by Dewey, circled around Ida, looking up at her. One time was not enough, and they circled around her again before sitting down on a bench near the fireplace. You're tall, said Dewey pleasantly. I bet you're taller than anybody. Ida lifted her shoulders. Oh, I'm not so tall. I'm as near 6 feet as I am 7. Are you a man or a woman? Asked Clay. Why, Clay Sutton, said Ellen, coming away from the table. That's not a nice thing to ask. In any way, can't you see she has long hair? It's not very long, said Clay, always one to argue. And besides, she's got on overalls. He sounded as if that meant she must surely be a man. I had a dress once, said Ida Early, smiling down at the twins, but it wasn't very practical for a lion tamer, so I switched to overalls. Dewey was asking, were you really a lion tamer? When Mr. Sutton and Aunt Ernestine came into the room. Randall always thought of Aunt Ernestine as a battleship. She wasn't especially big, but she always looked as if she were ready for war, and she moved as if everybody should get out of the way. Randall always did. He considered himself a rowboat by comparison. Before Aunt Ernestine spoke to Ida Early, she ordered Ellen and Randall to get busy clearing the breakfast dishes from the table. Randall didn't mind doing the work, but he hated the way Aunt Ernestine ordered him and Ellen about. He hoped the woman, Ida, would be hired and Aunt Ernestine would go back to Atlanta. The grown-ups stood across the room talking. Mr. Sutton explained that he was a foreman of a lumber yard and had to work long hours. He didn't have as much time to spend with his children as he'd like. This was his first Saturday he'd had off in a long time, and he needed someone to look after them. Soon it had been decided that Ida would be given a job. I can't pay much, said Mr. Sutton, on account of times are still not good, even if we do keep hearing that the Depression is easing up. I don't worry about the pay, said Ida, if the job's interesting and there's plenty of work to do. Aunt Ernestine said crossly, there's plenty of work. You can start by cleaning the house. Mr. Sutton said, maybe she'd like to sit down for a few minutes first and get acquainted with the children. She can get acquainted with them while she cleans the house, said Aunt Ernestine. Ida Early stood back of one of the big rocking chairs. Maybe I'll just rock a few minutes first, she said, taking off the baggy sweater that she wore. Then she held the sweater over her head, twirled it around twice, and let it go. It sailed to the corner, landing neatly on the hat rack. Everyone laughed except Aunt Ernestine, who was horrified. We take our garments across the room to hang them up, she scolded. Of course you do, said Ida. It's not just everybody who can throw things and make them land in exactly the right spot. Then she grinned. But I'll be happy to teach all of you the trick to it if I could have my sweater back. Dewey raced to get it for her. Ida sat down in the rocker. The secret of my good aim's in the wrist movement, she said. Then she announced, and now, ladies and gentlemen, from a seating position. Before Aunt Ernestine could protest, Ida took the sweater, whirled it around, and threw it to the hat rack again. She told Aunt Ernestine with a little smile, think how many steps you could save in a day. This time Clay started for the sweater, but Aunt Ernestine made him sit down. Ida Early then unbuttoned the big pocket across the top of her overalls and brought out a nickel bag of Bull Durham tobacco. As everybody watched, she rolled a cigarette using only one hand. Then she got up, struck a match on the seat of her overalls, and sat back down. After she had lit the cigarette and flicked the match halfway across the room into the fireplace, she dangled the bag of Bull Durham by the strings. Anybody care for a smoke? She asked. Randall laughed, and she tossed the bag of tobacco to him. Roll yourself one, she said. Why, Randall is only 11 years old, said Aunt Ernestine. What do you mean by offering him a cigarette? I wasn't really going to let him smoke, ma'am, said Ida. If he had started to light up, I was going to tell him about what cigarettes had done to me. She paused, and when nobody asked what cigarettes had done to her, she told her story anyway. You see, before I started smoking, I was a splendid-looking sight. Were you really? Asked Dewey. I was indeed. I had blonde, curly hair, diamond rings on every finger, and dimples. I wish you could have seen me. She took a long drag in her cigarette. But then I took to smoking and everything changed. My hair turned stringy just like it is now. She ran her fingers through it, and Randall thought of the coarse binder twine that he and J.C. had used in making the Scarecrow's hair. What happened to your diamond rings? Asked Clay. They fell off, said Ida Early. One by one they fell off, but I didn't mind too much. The hair doesn't bother me either, but I sure do hate it about the dimples. She looked down at Dewey and Clay, who were looking up at her, and winked at Randall and Ellen. There's nothing nicer than a good smile, she said, dimples or not. Nothing pleases me more. She looked around and must have been very pleased, Randall thought, because everyone was smiling. Everyone but Aunt Ernestine. The stew-making fool. "We'll be back before noon," said Aunt Ernestine a while later. "Do you think you can look after things here?" "Oh, yes, ma'am," answered Ida Early. "It would be my pleasure to look after things." "We'll have stew for lunch," said Aunt Ernestine. "Do you think you could prepare it?" Ida licked her lips and said enthusiastically, "Why, I'm a stew-making fool." But Aunt Ernestine frowned. "The beef is cut up and in the ice box. Brown it in the skillet before you put it in the pot to simmer, and you'll find vegetables in the pantry when it's time to add them." Ida nodded. "And just warm up the cornbread left from yesterday. Also, there's a bowl of turnip greens in the cupboard that can be heated." Aunt Ernestine went ahead to the car, and Mr. Sutton said, "Who wants candy from town?" Randall and the others scrambled to find their money. Each one had a special place for savings. Randall ran to the shoebox in the hall closet where he kept his and an empty snuff can. The rest of the box was where he stored his mitt and softball and the Indian arrowhead he'd found in the woods the day he had seen a bear. There was not much money in the snuff can, and he decided to spend only 3 pennies. He and Ellen were saving for Monopoly, a board game their friends had told them about. When he got back to the kitchen, Ellen was placing her order. She wanted licorice sticks. Ellen always wanted licorice sticks. The twins wanted jawbreakers, the 2 for a penny kind. Dewey wanted a green one and a yellow one, and Clay wanted 2 red ones. Randall handed his father his money. Before he could tell what he wanted, Clay was back saying, "I believe I'll have a green one and a yellow one instead." "Instead of 2 red ones," said Mr. Sutton cheerily, "I'll bring them to you, 1 green jawbreaker and 1 yellow jawbreaker." Randall ordered Baby Ruths, the penny ones, and Mr. Sutton said, "Now that gets everyone, doesn't it?" But Clay was back again. "I think I want a red one instead of the green one," he said. "And I want a red one too," said Dewey. "Wait a minute," said Mr. Sutton. "I'm all confused." "Could I be a help?" asked Ida. Mr. Sutton laughed. "I don't know, but you can try." Ida turned to Dewey. "Do you want a red one instead of a green one?" "No, instead of a yellow one," said Dewey. Ida turned back to Mr. Sutton. "That'll be a green one and a red one for Dewey, and a red one and a yellow one for Clay." "That's right," said Dewey. Mr. Sutton said, "Thanks, Ida. Thanks for the help." "Don't mention it," said Ida. She winked at the twins. "Of course, the purple ones are nice, too. They're grape flavored." Mr. Sutton grabbed his hat from the rack by the door. "Oh, no, no more mind changing today." He laughed as he hurried from the room. Randall was glad to hear his father sound happy. No one in the family had laughed much in the recent months. They mourned for Mrs. Sutton. The children spoke of their mother sometimes, but not as often as they had for a time. Randall supposed it had taken them a while to fully realize that nothing they could say would bring her back. He thought of her every day, and he expected everyone else did too. The twins still cried some nights because she wasn't there to put them to bed.